because it isn't a possibility. In fact, the more of a possibility it becomes, the more overwhelming it feels. Okay. So anxiety over knowing the right thing to do, but finding it too overwhelming to carry out. Pretty much the title. This happens with hobbies, schoolwork, daily life tasks where I'm acutely aware of the most guaranteed way of successfully doing the thing and finding it too overwhelming. However, the most optimal way of completing a task / practicing a hobby, etc., is obviously the most taxing, quote unquote, perfect method. If I'm writing an essay, it means looking through all the relevant sources, making sure each paragraph is concise yet detailed, and going over it 10 more times to vary my word choice more, fix sentences, and essentially make it the most perfect I can manage. This is obviously mentally and physically taxing, but the fact that other people can do it, and I've done it before, quote unquote, even if it was exhausting, and I know this is the best, most correct way of doing it, anything less would be laziness and produce bad work, then I'll regret it as it'll be my own fault. Stops me from doing any less, or otherwise I just won't try at all. I try to convince myself that people don't function like this, that they're not 100% quote unquote on all the time, and absolutely producing the peak of their work at all times. But it just seems like cope to me. That I'm just weak and get overwhelmed by what people can handle with ease, and there's something fundamentally wrong with me. Any advice on how to deal with this? So sometimes we want to do something. And what we want to do can be done in a couple different ways. We can do it okay, or we can do it the way that it's supposed to be done. But as this person points out, if we're doing things the way that they're supposed to be done, it's more effort. It's more taxing, right? There's like a proper way of doing things. There's an ideal way of doing things. And then what complicates factors even more is even if we start to tell ourselves, okay, well, like, I don't have to be perfect, right? I can just get started. Or like, I really just need to get it done. A B maybe is okay. There's another part of our mind that says other people can do it. Other people get A's. And what's even the most devastating is I have gotten an A in the past. I've done it properly. I've looked through all the sources. I've made sure each paragraph is concise yet detailed. And if you've done it well before, if you've done it close to perfect before, and if other people do it close to perfect before, it's an option. And this is what makes things so hard. Because if it wasn't really an option, then it would be easy, right? Like, it's like, oh, like, I'm never going to win a gold medal in swimming, so I can just go swimming. And I don't have to worry about not winning the gold. But if you've ever done it right before, you know that's a possibility for you. And if you know it's a possibility for you, then you want to find that formula to actually like find it, right? You want to achieve it because you know you can do it. You just need to find the right way to do it. And that's what makes it so paralyzing because it isn't a possibility. In fact, the more of a possibility it becomes, the more overwhelming it feels. Which I want you all to think about for a second. Because that's devastating. Because if I can do it, then I can't settle for any less. And so some people will look at this and they'll accurately say, okay, like, this is perfectionism. You need to stop being so perfectionistic. And they'll give us good advice. They'll say things like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Your goal should not be to do it perfect. Your goal should be to do it good enough. Just get started. Getting started is the hard part. You can always revise your way to perfection later. This is the right answer. And we know it's the right answer. We recognize we're being perfectionistic. We recognize that we should be able to, just get started. So then why don't we? So this is what's so hard about this kind of situation. When you know you can do a good job, and you know that getting started is the right answer, you know that being not perfectionistic is the right answer. How the hell do you do that? So here's one tip. If you have perfectionistic behavior and you feel overwhelmed by starting a task that you know deep in your heart that you can do, how do you approach this? Even if you know that the right answer is stop being perfectionistic and just get started. Why is that hard to do? That may be the right answer on paper, but internally, how do we get to that point? So that's what I'd love to share with y'all today. So we're going to start by kind of recapping. The weird thing about this is that you can do perfect, right? It's possible. You've done it before. You can get an A+ on this essay if you put forth the right kind of effort. And now this is when if I can get an A+ and you're telling me just settle for a B-, like, I don't want to do that. That's a terrible idea. Why would I settle for a B- when I could get an A+? That sounds idiotic. And by the way, other people can get A+ too, and I'm just as smart as they are. And if I settle for a B-, how will I ever get an A+? This sounds like a terrible idea, because if I settle for a B-, then all I'm going to get is B-. Instead, don't you think it's better if instead of settling for a B-, I figure out what the hell is wrong with me, fix it, so I can get A+ here on out? Doesn't that sound like a better strategy than just settling for a B- and just getting started? Because I know that just getting started isn't going to do actually a good job. So we have to appreciate what your mind does. What is your mind actually doing? Is it being paralyzed by perfectionism? Sure. Should you just stop being perfectionistic? Absolutely. In the same way you should just go to the gym every day, eat healthy, cut out caffeine, etc., etc., etc. Just be less perfectionistic, bro. Just be less perfectionistic, girl. So there's a skill that we as a society have lost. We used to do this as humans, but we've lost this skill. And if you want to let go of your perfectionism and still do a good job, this is a skill that you need to learn. I don't know that we ever taught it explicitly, and we never needed to teach it explicitly because we sort of did it so much, so naturally. But now that we don't even do it naturally, we actually have to explicitly teach it. I see a lot of people are guessing. Patience, experimentation. The skill is grieve. You have to learn how to grieve. So I even sort of noticed this over the last 20 years. So like, I live in the United States. And on September 11th, 2001, we had a couple of planes fly into the Twin Towers. It was a devastating moment, right? And we as a nation grieved. Everyone was grieving together. And like we mourned, and people in New York City became really nice and stuff like that. And that was the last time that I really remember, at least in the US, the nation as a whole grieving. And since then, I don't know if y'all have noticed, but we have disasters all the time. And we've just become numb to them. So many years ago, there was also like a school shooting at this place called the Columbine High School in the United States. And it was such an event that someone made a documentary about it. And everyone was like, oh my God, this is what's going on. And then like they happened again and again and again and again. So we used to like grieve as a society, right? So like even tribally, when someone passes away, we used to have like these grieving rituals. People would go through grief. There'd be the wake, there'd be the funeral, all this kind of stuff. We still kind of do those things. But now when you go to a funeral, what do you see? What are people doing? Everyone's on their phone. We've become numb to loss. We've started to use distraction instead of grief, because distraction is so easy now. Oh, something else is going on in the world. Am I going to stop and reflect on it? Right? I recently saw someone saying, make a TikTok. So a couple months ago, hopefully we can find this clip somewhere, but a couple months ago, I saw a TikTok of a nurse grieving very, very publicly after losing a patient. And there was this like epic country music or something in the background. And the nurse is like throwing her mask down on the ground. And she's like, oh. And like, I want to just understand what the hell, how did that happen? Did you lose the patient? Did you go to a quiet part of the hospital? Did you set up your phone, make sure the angle was good, make sure the focus was good, walk to the other side of the room, start recording, kind of check it, and then do this? Like this, what? This is what society has become. And now when something goes wrong in your life, what do? Got fired for your job? All right, let's go home, feel sad about ourselves, maybe get high, maybe play some video games, maybe binge watch some stuff. Maybe write some angry posts or angry tweets on the internet. So we've forgotten how to grieve. We just don't grieve anymore. And this is why everyone is like so messed up, because we've forgotten how to let go of things. We've forgotten how to be sad and move on. Now remember, we're talking about perfectionism. So what does that have to do with perfectionism? Really simple. So if you want to stop being perfectionistic, you got to grieve that perfection. Got to let it go. So stop and ask yourself, what would it mean if I didn't do it perfect? What would it mean if I got a B- instead of an A+? What would that do to me? How would I think about myself? Because in your mind, you've got a perfect version of you. A+. And you want to be that so bad. You don't want to give it up. You're going to keep it alive on life support as long as you can. You can't let that perfect version of you go. Because it's devastating, right? Because if you let it go, what do you become? I don't want to be this. I don't want to be this. I want to be this. The challenge is that when you strive for this is so hard to achieve that, as you pointed out, it's overwhelming. It's paralyzing. So start to ask yourself, so how do you grieve? Right? You process the loss. What would it mean to no longer be an A+ student? Oh my God, that would be so devastating. It would hurt, wouldn't it? Acknowledge that hurt. What would it mean about your future? It would mean that my future is dark and grim. Well, how's your future now? Well, it's dark and grim, but it could be brighter if I could overcome the feeling of overwhelmed and go to this. And something magical will happen. So this happens with everyone who grieves. When you lose a loved one, you think, oh my God, the future will never be the same. And that's true, right? That person will never be there again if they've passed away. But it doesn't mean that your future is bleak without them. And this is what the process of grief is. It's taking a negative event, internalizing it, and reshaping the future in a bizarrely even hopeful way. Right? So like, even if we lose a loved one, like there's a part of them that stays with us. It shapes us. We honor their memory. It makes us, in a weird way, like better people. Would it be nicer if they were still alive? Sure. But the future doesn't have to be bleak just because we've grieved some part of our life. In fact, what we tend to find, and I know this sounds really bizarre, but this is where kind of the science comes in. People who go through a healthy grieving process tend to be like better off afterward, versus the ones who stay attached to the possibility, live in the past, are the ones that get stuck. And so let's think about this for a second, because if your mind tells you, I've gotten an A+ in the past, here's how I did it. Where is your mind living? Is it living in the past, or is it living in the present? And the more that we get stuck in the past, the more paralyzed we become in the present. How do you undo that? You grieve. So if you're struggling with perfectionism and feeling overwhelmed by not doing it good enough, I'd start by grieving. And what does that mean practically? It starts by asking yourself, why am I so attached to this? What does it mean for me to do this? How would I feel about myself if I did not do that? How would I feel about myself if I just started writing the essay and not reading all the sources ahead of time? Well, I would feel bad. Well, hold on a second. What part of you would feel bad? If you spent the next hour jotting down notes of an essay and you pause and you ask yourself, how did I feel about myself? How would I feel about myself? This is where things become wild. Because if you actually do that, you're actually going to feel good about yourself. You didn't do it perfect, but there's still plenty of time. You got something done. You got started. Versus how would you feel about yourself if you continued to chase that perfection and didn't do anything for an hour? You'd feel broken. You'd feel busted. And this is the magic of grief. Because grief takes something that is a negative event and somehow transmutes it into something that is somewhat positive. We're not saying it's a net win, but it's the way that you take a negative event and you transmute it into something positive. So start to really ask yourself, what does this mean for me? What would it mean for me to just get started? What would I be giving up? And grieve that perfect self. And as you grieve that perfect self, the paralysis will go away. And as the paralysis goes away, you will start to act more. As you start moving forward, paradoxically, you go closer to getting the A+. You move away from the B-. And this is why it's so hard. Because achieving perfection starts with letting perfection go. We don't want to, though. Because if we let it go, then there's no guarantee. And that's a big part of grief. When a relationship ends, I want to hold on to that relationship. Why do I want to hold on to that relationship? Because there's no guarantee that I'll meet someone in the future. So a big part of that grief process is embracing the uncertainty. So if you struggle with perfectionism and feel overwhelmed because you know you can do it and you don't want to settle, what you actually need to do is grieve. It's not settling. It's letting go of that perfection. And paradoxically, as you let go of the perfection, you actually take a step closer to it. Questions? So that's the weird girl is asking, how is grieving different from reminiscing or nostalgia? So reminiscing or nostalgia can be part of the grieving process. But grieving is so nostalgia and reminiscing is when you literally go into the past. You sit there remembering. Grieving is the process of taking a loss and kind of like internalizing it and then looking forward. So reminiscing, like you can reminisce as part of the process of grief, right? But then like you have to internalize that process and then like look forward, because grieving is ultimately about moving forward. It's not about going into the past. And in fact, when people get stuck in the past is when they don't grieve. Okay, a lot of good questions. So how to grieve when pain is actually unbearable and invokes physical symptoms? So the first thing that I'd say is that if you're having physical symptoms, you should probably go see a medical professional and make sure that it isn't a physical problem. But sometimes the process of that grief does feel unbearable. And this is the kind of interesting thing where we sort of know that pain is a psychosomatic symptom. Now, sometimes when people hear the word psychosomatic, what they interpret it as is it's all in your head. But that's not my experience. So here's what we need to understand about the body and the mind. and to a certain degree, even things like the soul, if you believe in that stuff, is that it's all connected. So any insult to your body or any attack on your body will affect your mind, and any attack on your mind will affect your body. Right? We know this. So for example, emotions are a really good example of something that both manifests mentally and manifests physically. Tightness in my chest, queasiness in my stomach, fear in my head. So for sometimes what happens with people who struggle to grieve is they don't do the mental process up here, and so that pain comes out physically. So interestingly enough, the solution to the physical stuff, if you have psychosomatic pain, is actually mental work. And what confuses people is that when you have psychosomatic pain and they send you to a psychologist, you may think it's all in your head, or it can feel very invalidating. Whereas that's not the case. It's just that these two things are connected. And that physically we can only do so much for you. And so the thing that's left is the mental component. So when the pain is very unbearable, that's when I think processing grief becomes really, really important. Because then you leverage your mind to help your pain. So Caleb Hates Games is asking, how do you know when you're done grieving and not just ignoring the problem? Kind of easy, actually. It's like, what do you feel like when you wake up on a day-to-day basis? Is your life moving in the right direction? So when you grieve healthily, you generally speaking feel like optimistic and good about the future. And when you're ignoring the problem, you may distract yourself, but in the back of your mind, there's going to be a very, very tiny person at the back of your mind screaming at the top of their lungs when you're ignoring a problem. And when you grieve, that person is content. So the other thing that people are asking, another thing to ask about, how do you know when you're done grieving? So grieving doesn't necessarily finish in that way. So like grief is something that can continue to manifest over time. So you may be like done with like a particular stage of grieving, but a year later, let's say that, someone that you love passed away and their birthday rolls around, and during their birthday, it's like okay for that grief to come up again. So sometimes it's like a bit of a journey. It's episodes. So Justin Toons is asking, how do you grieve over a high expectation? It's a good question. So here are the steps to simply, it's hard, but it's simple. Ask yourself where this expectation came from. Ask yourself what it would feel like to not live up to that expectation. And then have compassion towards yourself with that disappointment. And once you have compassion towards yourself, then you can start to ask yourself, okay, so what can we do about it? So I'll give you all kind of a simple example. Let's say I'm a coach, okay? And let's say that my team lost a game. So if I'm that coach, what do I tell my team? So we sit down and we say, does it suck that we lost the game? Absolutely. Could we have played better? Absolutely. In what ways could we have played better? Okay, this, and this. Now, just because we lost that game and just because we played better doesn't mean that we are failures. Do we need to learn from our lessons? 100%. So here's what I want you to do. I don't think you're a bad person. I don't think you're a failure at life. You lost a game. I want you to practice. I want you to prepare for next week. The loss is over. Let it go. We're going to learn lessons from it, and I have faith in you that you can win next week. Does that make sense? That's just the process you have to do with yourself when you go through grief and when you want to let go of like high expectations. It's acknowledging your shortcomings, having compassion, and then formulating a plan to move forward. Okay? There's a good question. How do I grieve a long farewell, such as a family member with Alzheimer's who's ill for years? That's really challenging. That's the kind of thing where I wish there was a simple answer to it. So losing a family member with Alzheimer's has a very, very bittersweet kind of grief. So on the one hand, it can hurt more to see this person become a shell of who they used to be. And it can also be a blessing because you get the benefit of time. Right? So like they don't go away completely. Like if you want to say words to them, you can say words to them. Things like that. So I think that's really where, if you're really struggling with someone who's got Alzheimer's, what I would really, really recommend is chances are there's a medical professional involved, right? Especially if there's a diagnosis for Alzheimer's. And if they've got a neurologist or a psychiatrist or something like that, I would talk to them and say, do you have any recommendations for resources or support around grieving someone who's like suffering from a chronic illness? So thankfully in illnesses like cancer, like we've got that, there's a lot more support, generally speaking, for things like cancer treatment and grief. It's bittersweet because sometimes people want to lose someone kind of like a Band-Aid where it's like, they just die and there's not a protracted process. And the downside of that is that you don't get to say goodbye. Right? So it's challenging for sure.